helped his rich clients hide their wealth from the IRS in Swiss bank accounts.
Former UBS AG banker Brad Birkenfeld first reported in 2007 that he and his colleagues had encouraged rich Americans to store more than $20 billion in offshore Swiss bank accounts.
Bradley
Birkenfeld was an American banker who worked for the UBS bank in Geneva. His job was very simple. He solicited wealthy American clients who might want to hide their money by investing it in Switzerland and throughout the rest of the world. He was very good at it. He spent his time traveling between Switzerland and the United States. It was completely illegal. You don't have the right, when you're a Swiss banker, to go to the US to solicit clients. We know all the tricks. They would organize classical music festivals, boat races, anything that would attract wealthy people. And then at dinner or at lunch, UBS offered to hide their money.
For 5 years, Bradley Birkenfeld served faithfully the UBS bank. His star client was Russian billionaire Igor Olonikov.
Well, this is a memento from happier times. It's a gift that was given to me by UBS, and they had the bell cast with the name of my yacht, Rusalka. Birkenfeld called me and said that it was time I should move my money. And then he suggested it should be moved to UBS in Geneva. My initial deposit with the bank was just a partial deposit. I moved $60 million into the account.
Soon, it was up to $200 million, which was never declared to the IRS. Why would Switzerland's largest private wealth management bank, with 30,000 employees on U.S. soil, take such a risk? In 1999, the man who would 2 years later become the bank's world president became head of UBS in Switzerland. His name was Marcel Ospel, and he was widely ambitious. Nicolas Forissier, a former employee of UBS in France, blew the whistle on their tax evasion schemes. He remembers the time clearly.
When he was in charge, Mr. Ospel wanted us to be the best at everything, everywhere. That was quite clear, and particularly in the United States. He said it himself in the press, "We will be as strong and powerful as Goldman Sachs in the United States."
Ospel clearly had big ideas. In May of 2000, UBS burst onto the New York Stock Exchange and set up the biggest trading floor in the world, with 1,400 traders. The cornerstone of their campaign was tax evasion in all its forms.
In 2005, the order came from Zurich to open the floodgates. What we'd been trying out in France since 2002 was now to go large scale in all countries where it could work, including the USA.
In the UBS building in Geneva, each country had its own desk, a whole department responsible for illegal soliciting. Bradley Birkenfeld, assigned to the USA desk, was among the best, but his star client, Igor Olonikov, was in the crosshairs of the FBI. He'd been put under a wiretap, and a search warrant was issued on May 24, 2005.
They knew specifically what it is that they were looking for. They specifically wanted anything to do with the offshore banking, the UBS accounts. UBS was very concerned that I had become a target, and that my records had been searched, and that the U.S. government was focusing on me.
After the search of Olonikov's premises, things started seriously to unravel for Bradley Birkenfeld.
Birkenfeld knew the IRS was going to apprehend him, so he decided in 2007 to show his hand and appear before the IRS, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the U.S. Senate, saying, "I can give you information if you like, but in return, I expect to get protection as a whistleblower. If you give information, you get protection."
A whistleblower is someone who exposes illegal practices within their own company.
But the Justice Department and the IRS told him they had enough information implicating him in illicit and illegal practices to be able to prosecute him, and therefore he wouldn't be eligible for such protection.
Bradley Birkenfeld was arrested in May 2008.
So Birkenfeld confessed. He told them how he picked out his clients in the States and how, to please them, he'd hide 2 diamonds in his tube of toothpaste and smuggle it across the border. Every trick you can imagine was used by Credit Suisse to get their hands on the money of wealthy Americans.
That was 19,000 clients and around 20 billion Swiss francs, which is about $19 billion.
Of the percentage of American accounts that you represented, how many would you say were trying to evade taxes?
My own clients. I would say about 90%.
Did people tell you this was their intention when they opened an account?
It was the unwritten rule. You didn't have to discuss it. People wouldn't fly all the way to Switzerland to open accounts just because they wanted to declare their money.
By 2008, the U.S. Justice Department had enough evidence against him to begin legal proceedings, while at the same time suing UBS, the largest private player in international finance.
The Swiss bank before us deliberately entered the United States, actively sought U.S. clients, and secretly helped those U.S. clients defraud the United States of America. UBS has specifically acknowledged wrongdoing and admitted in court that it, quote, participated in a scheme to defraud the United States and its agency, the IRS.
UBS used a variety of strategies to conceal their cross-border activities. They instructed their bankers who traveled to the United States to falsely represent the customs that they were traveling for pleasure. They also recommended that bankers rotate hotel accommodations in the United States to avoid detection. UBS bankers used counter-surveillance techniques, including encrypted spreadsheets and codes to help prevent the detection of their marketing efforts, as well as the identities and undeclared assets of the U.S. clients.
But why was the U.S. launching such a violent offensive against UBS? To understand that, we must remember that in 2007, the subprime mortgage scandal had already begun to wreak havoc. The major banks had triggered an historic economic crisis that had hit the general public hard. The state coffers were empty, and budget deficits had exploded. They had to find money.
Until the early 2000s, the thinking was, well, who, after all, is using these big Swiss banks? Just a few wealthy people. It wasn't that big a deal. However, in 2007-2008, university studies came out showing that tax evasion in France, the United States, Germany, and England was colossal. In France, we believe it to be the equivalent of 20% of government revenues. That's almost as much as the budget deficit. With the crisis, if both human and technical resources were employed, a lot of money could be recovered. That encouraged the IRS and the European tax authorities to go all out in the battle.
Even though UBS had...
And at a time when millions of Americans are losing their jobs, their homes, and their health care, it is deeply troubling that thousands of the wealthiest among us have actively sought to evade their civic and legal duty to pay taxes. The Department of Justice is committed to doing all that it can to aid the Internal Revenue Service in locating those who would seek to hide behind secret accounts and to hold them accountable under the federal tax laws.
The UBS follies were timely. It was time to punish this bank that had dared to poach on American soil.
Raise your right hand.
The findings of the investigation were overwhelming. UBS was obliged to bow before the law.
I am here to make absolutely clear that UBS genuinely regrets any compliance failures that may have occurred. We will take responsibility for them. We will not seek to minimize them. On behalf of UBS, I'm apologizing. I am committing to you that we will take the actions necessary to see that this does not happen again.
Provide us with any factual.
UBS was fined $780 million.
Yes.
A paltry fine compared to the amount at stake, and it didn't pose any problem for UBS. The main concern of the IRS was to get names. So they just said, give us names. If you refuse to provide the information required by the IRS, the response is clear, we'll take away your license. You'll no longer have the right to operate on US markets. Well, the Swiss banks couldn't have that.
It was blackmail. For a big bank to lose its footing in the main global market in dollars was unthinkable. But giving up the names of its cheating clients threatened the very thing that had made Switzerland's fortune: banking secrecy. There was panic in Switzerland. In Bern, they held a crisis meeting.
Madam Federal Councillor, what are you discussing tonight? Oh, nothing.
The Federal Council, the Swiss government, met in an emergency meeting on February 19, 2009, away from the cameras. The next day, the government would make an historic decision.
The decision made yesterday requires the FINMA to hand over to the U.S. Department of Justice information on UBS clients who, in the bank's opinion, may be suspected of tax fraud under Swiss law.
UBS was authorized to deliver the names of 285 American clients to the U.S. authorities. For the first time, banking secrecy laws had been overturned, and by the Swiss government itself. Banking secrecy was one of the oldest laws of the Swiss Confederation. Yet, in this standoff with the US, the Swiss parliament, which had not even been consulted, kept a low profile. Jean-Christophe Schwab, a socialist MP, explained his colleague's silence.
UBS risked being placed under judicial supervision in the United States, or even being split up by the U.S. courts. And then, since UBS is a systemic risk bank, in other words, its assets are superior to the GDP of the country, its closure, or bankruptcy, would probably have resulted in a huge disaster. The Swiss Confederation had to intervene quickly. It had even to resort to emergency laws without any legal basis, because the government believed the interests of the country were at stake. And basically, these emergency laws allowed them to give clients' names to the tax authorities, which, theoretically, banking secrecy law doesn't allow.
The U.S. blackmail worked. On the right, the consensus was the same.
The Swiss government did what it could under the circumstances. It was under tremendous pressure from a number of countries much more powerful than itself. So we really had to adapt.
But the Americans wanted a lot more than those 285 names. For them, it was only the beginning of an arm wrestling match in which they had the upper hand. A complaint filed with a court in Florida enabled them to demand that UBS deliver the identities of 52,000 American clients suspected of tax evasion. It was a declaration of war, a matter now for the highest levels of state. Micheline Calmy-Ray, head of the Swiss Diplomatic Corps, met with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Washington.
There has been an agreement reached in the litigation that was just reported to the court in Florida that confirms there has been an understanding between the Swiss government and our government over the ongoing litigation concerning UBS. I'm very happy to begin the discussions with her. Thank you so much. Thank you.
These were difficult negotiations. They went on for months. On August 21st, 2009, the Swiss government announced that it had agreed to provide U.S. authorities with the names of 4,500 clients.
Ladies and gentlemen, in recent months, the federal government has, for the first time, acted on behalf of a company. It has taken extremely high risks to minimize the damage that certain representatives of UBS have inflicted on the reputation of the Swiss financial sector and hence the entire country.
For the second time, under American pressure, the Swiss authorities broke the sacrosanct principle of banking secrecy in order to save UBS, the country's largest bank.
The Swiss government has a policy that to many observers seems rather strange. A seemingly total lack of foresight and a tendency to be submissive to large financial groups. When they ask for something, the government gives it. This means that it's the banks that are running things. UBS had 60% of the mortgage market, so it's understandable that the government said, these institutions are too big to fail. So, whatever it might mean for our entire legal system, they must be saved.
In Bern, still no reaction from the parliament, but there's an explanation for this complicit silence.
The problem with us is that we're a parliament. We're supposed to work on parliamentary activities. And there are a lot of people who lobby on behalf of businesses. There are deputies who are really working as lobbyists. And they're paid for it. The pharmaceutical industry and the health insurance lobbies are very strong. There's also a banking lobby. Some deputies are on the boards of banks. We found out that some parties have received donations depending on how their members voted. They ticked off the votes directly, and if there weren't enough yeses for something, the money would be cut.
There's no salary. There are no professional deputies. There's no incompatibility. And if you're in a right or center party, which unfortunately are largely in the majority, then as soon as you're elected, you're put on the boards of UBS, Credit Suisse, Novartis, or the large multinational trusts, which are usually also owned by the banks. As for the banks, the banking oligarchy has a majority in Parliament, in both chambers automatically.
Mired in their conflicts of interest, Swiss MPs left the field open to U.S. maneuvering. For the United States, obtaining the names of 4,500 American tax evaders was just the beginning of a long-term offensive.
The IRS was very, very clever because it allowed a period of voluntary disclosure. The message was, fellow Americans, you have hidden your money in Switzerland or elsewhere. If, thanks to UBS, we come across your name, you are going to pay your overdue taxes. You will pay penalties. We're going to prosecute you, and you may even go to prison. If you just turn yourself in, you'll just pay your overdue taxes, penalties, and fines. We won't prosecute you. And they got 15,000 names. They'd expected 4,000 from UBS. 15,000 Americans turned themselves in.
The 15,000 Americans who turned themselves in were made to pay their taxes and late penalties. The billionaire, Igor Olonikov, was fined $52 million. Bradley Birkenfeld, who was also found guilty, spoke to the press before he went to prison on January 8, 2010.
This was the largest tax fraud case in the world. And I sacrificed my reputation, my life, my finances, and this is how I get treated?
He was sentenced to 40 months in prison and served 32 of them. But when he got out, there was a big surprise.
We are very pleased to announce that Brad Birkenfeld, the most important tax whistleblower in the history of the country, has received a major award of $104 million from the IRS under the IRS Whistleblower Program.
$104 million. That's what the IRS decided to give Bradley Birkenfeld. As part of its anti-tax evasion offensive, the U.S. government was encouraging people to be whistleblowers.
This award by the IRS is being made thanks to the information provided by Brad that led to over $5 billion and counting in tax payments being made by big banks and wealthy individuals who tried to evade paying their fair share of taxes. Brad's information served as the basis for unprecedented actions against the Swiss bank UBS and collateral impact on other enforcement activities.
And as a bonus, Birkenfeld inherited the prestigious title of whistleblower.